Good evening, everyone. My name is Councillor Ogi Simic, and I'm chairing tonight's meeting of the Port Phillip Planning Committee. And I declare this meeting of the Planning Committee for the Port Phillip City Council open, and I welcome the members of the public who are here tonight. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Delegated William clan of the Boonwurrung. We pay respects to their elders, both past and present. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. Council has a local law that determines how this meeting will be conducted. There's a time allotted to tonight's agenda for public question time. There's also an opportunity for members of the public to ask questions or make a comment on a specific item on tonight's agenda. This will be done prior to the committee considering the item. If you wish to ask a question or speak to a report, please complete the blue form that's available at the table just outside the chamber and hand it to a staff member, and I know that some of you have already done so. If you've already registered online, please ensure you let a staff member know you're present, and I encourage you to try to limit your questions and comments to around 3 minutes and to try to avoid repeating any points that have been previously made by other speakers. This committee can only address questions and deal with items within its delegation, that is, planning matters. All planning committee meetings are live streamed to allow the community to watch and listen to meetings in real time. Please note that under Council local law, this meeting cannot be filmed or audio taped unless permission is granted by the Chair. In the unlikely event of an emergency evacuation, please follow instructions of the emergency warden, which I believe is Kirsten. Kirsty. Okay. So, let's move to the agenda. Item 1's apologies. Councillors, we're all here tonight, so there's no apologies. Minutes of the previous committee meeting held on the 28th of August 2019. Can I have a motion confirming those minutes? Councillor Gross, seconded Councillor Voss. We'll now vote on that motion. All those in favour? All those against? That motion is carried unanimously. Declaration of conflict of interest, item 3. Councillors, are there any conflict of interest pertaining to any items on our agenda tonight? I note that there are no conflicts of interest. Item 4 is public question time. So, councillors, we have a number of people who have asked to speak in relation to the items tonight, but no one for public question time. So, if it's okay, I will move on to councillor question time. Councillors, are there any questions that you'd like to ask of officers? I note that there's no questions from councillors. So we'll now move to the presentation of reports. We'll move to item 6.1, which is 1012 399 Williamstown Road in Port Melbourne. There's no members of the public wishing to ask any questions. Councillors, do any councillors have any questions in relation to this report? Councillor Voss, whenever you're ready.
Actually, I did ask this one earlier, but around Murphy's Reserve being used as a construction site. Is there any way that we could have some security around it not being used as for construction for this particular site?
For you, Mr. Chair, the issue of permissions for construction vehicles, hoardings and the like, is not something which we can condition through a planning permit. It is handled through Council's City Permits Department, but noting that Council is, I believe, both the owner and the Committee of Management for the park, I think we have some sound grounds for ensuring that construction vehicles associated with this are contained to the subject site.
Councillor Voss.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I'd just like to ask about provision for service vehicles. I note that there isn't any provision in this application. If service vehicles were to be part of a condition, where might they be located on the site?
For you, Mr Chair, our ambitions with the redevelopment of all the lots in this currently industrial subdivision is that the car parking for each developer be contained within the building, and that the current at-grade car parking spaces in the common property area be deleted site by site, so that that area can become open space and wider roads for the community. So the answer is inside the building, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr Guthridge. Are there any further questions? Councillor Brand?
Yes, I just noted that the urban design assessment of this building is pretty damning of the existing building, and I think pretty damning of the proposed amendments to it as well. Could you? And it's based around the problem of around really the ground floor perimeter of the building, to do with the number of car park openings, the lack of activation, the loss of residence entrances and what have you. Could you, just for the record, I suppose, or just to sort of make me feel better about it, just outline the conditions that you're putting on specifically to address the problems of the ground floor, I suppose, urban design consequences of your recommendation?
Through you, Mr Chair. This proposal is an application to amend an existing permit, and the essential building envelope, the built form and so forth of the building, the height, are pretty much unchanged from the current approval. The facade treatments are different, but they maintain the
I'm just talking
the
about
existing
the
approved themes. At ground level, at the rear, officers have, including the urban designers, have noted concerns that there is multiple openings and the ground floor rear of the premises has become dominated by building services. So we have recommended a new condition 1I for India, which, amongst other things, looks to delete one of the openings facing onto that rear boundary, and its replacement with a entrance for a residential lobby, which would join with the other residential entry coming from the Jail Murphy reserve side of the building, and associated redesign of the back of house facilities. It gives the architects scope to revise that to provide a much better appearance to that internal road.
Thank you, Mr Guthridge. Are there any further questions? Councillor Brand, that resolves your query. Would you mind turning off your microphone in that case, please? If there's no further questions, we'll move to a resolution. Is there a councillor that'd like to move the officer's resolution or something else? Councillor Voss?
I've got an alternative motion.
You've got an alternate recommendation?
Yes.
Okay, can we have that displayed on the screen? And can you please read it out, Councillor Voss?
The addition
yes,
is just half a sentence to 3.1.1. I'll read the whole lot then, a whole part of that. That Council advises the Minister that it supports the amended application subject to conditions set out in section 11.23 of this report, and an additional condition requiring the provision of a dedicated car space for service vehicles.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. So the text highlighted in black on the screen is the addition. Do we have a seconder for this recommendation? Councillor Pearl. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to this resolution?
Yes, thank you. Happy to support this application. It's in Wirraway, a very family-friendly area of the Fisherman's Bend Urban Renewal Area. This is a Section 72, so we're only looking at the changes. We're not looking at the whole application. As Councillor Brand has pointed out, there's much to be desired about the whole application, and unfortunately we can't do much about that. We also can't do much about, some of the other things lacking in it, for example, affordable housing. But there are some merits in it, in that it has reduced the units from 50 to 23. And I also support the crossover reduction from 3 to 1. I have been concerned about the waste and the removalist vehicles reversing in, and I'm supportive of the condition that the trucks will now load and unload in the service lane behind it, and also supportive of the increased setback. So I support this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Councillor Pell? No worries. Are there any councillors wishing to speak, either for or against? There being no further speakers, I will then move to a vote. All those for? All those against? That passes unanimously. We'll now move to item 6.2, which is 255 to 271 Bank Street, South Melbourne. And I understand there's a number of speakers wishing to speak to this tonight. Can I please start with Mr. Rod Hill? Mr. Hill, if you can please move to the seat in the middle, turn on the microphone and say your name and your suburb for the record.
Thank you. Planning Committee and Council, for actually accepting my request to speak on behalf of the Bank and Cecil Group residential group in concerns with the development in Bank Street. I've presenting this along with a PowerPoint, and there are a number of concerns that we have, and number one is in regards to the proposed building of the 53 residence and commercial outlets with only 41 car spaces. Now, obviously, I'm speaking towards the problem with car parking in the area, and with the 41 car spaces, this does not meet current council regulations. Point two that I'd like to make is that the car parking will be provided in stacker form, and this is, or the reputation of these is that people prefer to use other means rather than the stackers, which means that they'll be parking in the street, and that's going to increase an already existing problem in Bank Street. Can we flick to the next slide? Oh no, go back. Sorry. And point three is the insufficient parking in the area is already affecting residents who find it hard enough to find spaces during the week, and especially weekends, when obviously you're aware, and we totally support, that is the parking in South Melbourne for everyone to go to the market. Now, the next slides that are coming up, basically they were taken last Tuesday, and this is 8 p.m. at night. And you can see that you cannot see any visible vacant parking spots. This is 8 o'clock in the evening, and it's in a residential area. And that's our concern, and this is the problem that is existing now, let alone another 52 apartments going into that area. Again, this is looking at the development site, and you can see right there on both sides of the streets there are no parking spots whatsoever. Thank you. There's also the issue of no provision of guest parking and drop-off zones in the existing plans with the proposed development. So again, apart from residents, no guest facilities and no drop-off facilities. Point 5 I'd like to make is that there is no allowance for parking for any of the commercial establishments down on the lower level. So again, whether they be coffee shops or whatever the outlets are, there is no provision in the building design to cater for any additional parking for anyone using those facilities. Point 6, by adding 53 units and commercial shops, the increase in traffic, which is already very heavy in Bank Street, will be increased. Bank Street is already being used as a thoroughfare or a throughway for Dorcas and Park Street because of the lights, etc. And of course, it's also pretty much an emergency exit for the South Melbourne police station. So it's a very busy road, and with that additional parking with people coming in and out, that's going to even increase the problem there. Point 7, that is dumping of the 53 residents in the area without providing adequate parking will adversely affect surrounding businesses. It's an area where there's short-term parking, and people come in for an hour, go to the market, they leave, other people come in. With more residents in there, that's going to really hinder businesses in the South Melbourne area and especially the South Melbourne market. And if this building does go ahead, point 8, we're also concerned about the massive increase in parking in regards to the builders or the workers on site. That is the first of the presentations that we have in regards to the Bank and Cecil Street Community Group. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And just before you go, it was remiss of me before, to not make sure that you've said your name and your suburb into the record. If you can do that.
Rod Hill, resident 248 Bank Street, South Melbourne.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. There's some formality to these meetings, so I apologise for making you do that at the end. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'll now call the second speaker, Robert Schmittart. And if I can also please get you to say your name and your suburb into the record, please. Yeah, it's not, so just please press the button in the middle. Thank you.
Robert Schmidt at 200 Cecil Street, South Melbourne. I'll keep this short. I'd like to address the issue of car stacker being installed in the building.
Sorry, would you mind just maybe bringing the microphone a little bit closer to you? It's just, okay. Thank you very much.
I'd like to address the issue of a car stacker being installed in the building we're talking about. So, not knowing yet which system is going to be installed, whether it's automatic, semi-automatic, who it's produced by. Depending on the system, a car stacker costs between $30,000 and $60,000 per car space to install. This translates roughly the same cost as conventional car space at street level or anywhere for that matter. Depending on the installation contract, this can translate up to an additional $500 per quarter per resident, and most web forums suggest finding other existing spaces in preference to going down the path of using stackers. Despite the information provided by companies in glossy product descriptions, forums also comment on the most overlooked facts. The stackers are notorious for failing, needing replacements, and have very high monthly energy costs. It's been demonstrated time and time again that stackers don't work in residential buildings on a large scale as compared to office parking. People won't spend the time it takes to wait for their cars, typically 2 to 3 minutes, to be loaded or unloaded using the stackable technique. And when someone leaves something in the boot or cabin of their car and have to wait 3 minutes to retrieve it, they prefer to park on the street, impacting on everyone else in the surrounding streets. In this particular situation, 40 cars, let's assume that it's a 2-minute wait, not a 3. 40 cars wanting to leave at the same time, 2 minutes each, that's 80 minutes, or roughly 1.5 hours to empty a stacker. I think it'd be very reasonable to assume that everyone will be queuing to park underground as opposed to parking on the street, so the street will be the way to go. Stackable parking is also limited to small to medium-sized cars, raising a question of where to larger, more common for all-wheel drives, work utes or vans park. You saw from the photograph taken in Bank Street that there's a very large proportion of vans and utes. So, not sure how that's going to be addressed. It seems to me that despite being next to a 30-storey tower, which occupies a substantial block, the land allocated to this proposed development isn't sufficient for the magnitude of the building proposed. and a highly priced, unreliable, energy-guzzling car stacker that many residents won't be able to use and most won't want to use isn't helping sell this proposal. If Telstra want to sell their land off, I'm surprised that they've picked Bank Street and haven't identified the old Inkerman Street exchange. Same council, no heritage overlay, and a great parcel of land out back with 8-storey buildings alongside, no objections from any of the neighbours, and it may not be 11 storeys, but there's also no need for a car stacking with a much larger ground space available and plenty of development around to set a precedent. It's a shame that we didn't have more notice to present at this meeting, because I would have liked to have invited some of the traders at the South Melbourne market and asked them how they feel an extra 50 to 100 cars will impact on their business. And it's all very well saying that it's very easy to go and find somewhere else to park, but they seem to already have, and they're picking our block. Using local knowledge and a little bit of business acumen, they wouldn't have to think too hard to perhaps consider maybe Preston or Footscray, 2 other upcoming markets that don't have the issues that South Melbourne has at the moment or will have in the future if this goes ahead. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.
Mr. Mitch Dowd.
Hi, I'm Mitch Dowd at 242 Bank Street, South Melbourne. I'm going to talk about the design and the future and precedents of this applicated building. If an 11-storey building is built on this site, what precedents does it set for future use and height restrictions in the area? This proposed development would affect the state government would affect what the state government could do with the surrounding area in the future, an example of low-level public housing being the future. The concerns about shadowing, privacy, wind, parking and community would become even more important. I think that's an important part to think about, is that if that did come up, and in the future, how does that affect that other area around it? There is a sad lack of green design in this building, with no solar, water collection and proper open space. The area that has been allocated as green are the nature strip, which already exists, and a few very small insignificant areas. And what is the rating of this going to be? Is it 7.5, which is theoretically what it should be as we go into the future, or is it going to be what they used to do at 5? The idea of shops for food and drink on the ground level is a concern with the hours of operation, rubbish, parking and noise. It also take away from the residential atmosphere in that street. We've already got enough cafes and shops in Clarendon Street and Coventry Street, all in walking distance. I don't see the need to put more shops in the area. Looking at Grogan site for residential buildings, they've built, this is a poor cousin with little consideration to architectural design, open space and community. They obviously can do very good buildings in Denmark Street in Kew, Greenwich in Fairfield as examples. And why would they not do one here? And especially as we become even more concerned with green values and community wellbeing. We went to a consultation 3 months ago to discuss and voice any concerns or thoughts to the developers and council. Many concerns were voiced, but sadly months later not one change has been taken off the original plans, and our voices and the community seem to not be heard. I found that actually quite amazing, that of all the points we brought up, not one has been looked at. So in conclusion, this development would set a precedence for future building. This development would affect what the state government could do on the area in the future. This development is poor in design and lacks green, sustainable community interests. After consultation and voicing of community concerns, nothing has been changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dowd. Next speaker is Kishel Black. Ms. Black, would you please mind reading your name and suburb into the record?
Thank you. My name is Kishel Black. I'm a resident of Bank Street in South Melbourne. Thank you for hearing our concerns tonight. I'm a resident and owner of a home on Bank Street, and I'm very concerned for our community. The heart of our community is, of course, the South Melbourne market. It's the icon. It draws visitors and locals. It's a massive support for our elderly and our migrant population, or a lot of actually who live at Park Towers. It supports local businesses by drawing visitors in. It provides generations of employment and is a leader in being green. My concern regarding this new construction is the impact that it's going to have. 53 apartments. The average household has, what, 2.4 cars? That could be 100 cars introduced into our street. With 40 spaces, doesn't add up. Market days are already impactful. Most shoppers already have to do regular circles through the streets looking for car parks now. It's well known that parking is tight and the waits are long. As a resident of Bank Street, I know and see firsthand drivers' frustrations, often sometimes aggression, and looking for parking spaces. And it's especially on market days, and we accept that. But this is getting bigger than market days. By decreasing spaces to park, this will deter visitors and locals away from the market and local businesses, as they will just give up and eventually not come back because it's all too hard. So with the new construction, it's supposed to be providing more shops to the street. Where do their patrons park? With those businesses that are going to open up under there, they're going to be impacted. So where are the guests and visitors to this new resident going to park? How will they construct this building? Where do the builders and tradesmen park? Do they get special allowances? So the use of this space could be far better developed for our beautiful community and the greater green impact than having another monstrous tower built on it and the devastation that it's going to cause. Thank you.
So, quick question. Is that all right?
Yes, Councillor Pearl's got a question of Ms.
Tell me,
Black.
what do you think would be the appropriate level of development on this site? It's not a technical question, so I'm just asking for your opinion.
No, I mean, there could be residents built there, but you've got to do the appropriate amount of parking for it. We're already at capacity. We can't even park in our own streets. So, you know...
So it's not so much the height or the looks of it from your point of view?
The height is horrific.
So
I was under the impression that there was a 6-storey limit in South Melbourne. And, you know, everything else seems to be tastefully designed, so it's not... But this is a tower. It's almost encroaching on our street.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Black, and thank you for answering Councillor Pearl's questions. I've got the Macquarie next. Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Macquarie, would you mind just turning on the microphone, just a button in the middle?
Okay, sorry. Dee Macquarie, I'm also a resident of South Melbourne, Bank Street. So I just wanted to reiterate what my fellow residents had said, is that we're quite concerned that there weren't any changes from when our voice was presented before. The issue with parking, the design is quite disappointing in relation to the green areas. And there seems to be no visibility of changes to the parking currently in the street to accommodate that. Two questions I have are in relation to what precedent would the building of this property set for future of Park Towers? Should that need to be rebuilt or refashioned at a lower level? And the other one is in relation to rubbish of additional residents. So currently we have a lot of problems with rubbish being dumped out of cars, with all the cars there. And so I would just imagine with another 100 cars that we're going to have similar sorts of problems. We do have a lot of wind in that area, and so rubbish days, we just have the streets full of rubbish. The other thing we do have an issue with is the shopping trolleys, that they seem to breed along that area, and I imagine with all those people coming into the area, that into the property, that we would have more shopping trolleys. So that's just another thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McCree. Next is Różana Jurovetsky. I hope so.
That's better. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Różana Jurovetsky. I'm the daughter-in-law of a resident of Park Towers, Regina Jurovetsky. She and her husband, Mark, live on the 9th floor on the northern side, and I think their apartment is the westernmost on that floor. So I speak on their behalf, and their main concern with this development is the height, and we do note the recommendation to delete one level. That will help, however, it won't go far enough. They will still be overshadowed. Now, to give you some background, there are people in their mid-80s who are of increasingly poor health, increasingly poor mobility, and increasingly they stay home. I know that might go against popular medical opinion, but they catch a cold at the drop of a hat. They'll be increasingly staying home, especially in winter, and in winter is when they will have no natural light there at all. Now, some of their health issues include mental health, and lack of daylight, natural daylight, is going to significantly affect their mental health to their detriment. And they actually have a medical opinion on this as well. So their view of the situation is that they will be living in a well, pretty desolate. So they ask for your consideration of that situation, just so that they can live their remaining years with a bit of joy from sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. John Lowndes.
Hello, John Lowndes, President of Park Towers Tenant Management. I'm here on my own behalf, and also on behalf of my tenants that I share the building with at Park Towers. I agree with the traffic will be ridiculous. Bank Street is parked out every day anyway. Stackers are notoriously misused or unused, as the other gentleman said. Couldn't agree more. My sister has a stacker in her flat in East St Kilda, and also too the thought that you can't have a parking permit for a car if you buy a flat without a internal park is kind of ridiculous, because there's a roaring trade going on in urban Melbourne with people's parking visitor permits, whether it's not darling, bottle of wine, or if it's $50 a month, whatever. There's a lot of pensioners around. They might be in high-valued housing, but they're doing it poor, cash poor. Our tenants on the north side of the building would suffer considerably. They would lose the northern light during the summer, and the noise would be horrific while it was being built. In fact, I think they could probably stop it on those grounds alone. Some of the people range from 80s up until their 90s on that side of the building. And of course there are young families with children, and women who are stuck indoors all day with small children because they don't drive, or they're fearful to go out because they wear a hijab, which is really even more disappointing. I think the air conditioning banks on the building are going to just make it hotter in Park Towers, because we don't have split systems. The department won't allow them. Portable air conditioners battle to keep up. yeah, do I really have to say any more? It's a really unremarkable building. There should be some really stunning townhouses built there within the present profile of the building, with roof gardens and things like that, and sell them off to very, very wealthy people. This is just jamming people into more unattractive housing. If it was really looked good, I mean, and as far as the heritage goes, it's just going to be a terracotta stump with a bit of a pavlova block of flats stuck on the top. I mean, really, that's it. I mean, you may as well just knock the whole thing down. It's also sitting on pink rock, which means you could dig down and put a car park deep down, but that's expensive. So, you know, stack them instead. Thanks, guys. Look, I really have to run, but needless to say that if it goes anywhere, we'll be representing all of our tenants at VCAT to try and stop it, because it's just another appalling, building really in the wrong place. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Lowndes. All right. So, councillors, that's the end of our speakers and public asking questions on this topic. I'll now go to councillor question time. I might kick off with one first, if that's okay. Just in relation to parking, quite a few of the speakers have brought up issues around parking, including issues around visitor parking. Can officers please detail how these issues will be addressed?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it's important to note the location of the site and accessibility to public transport. Nonetheless, the proposal incorporates car parking for a large proportion of the development. With the proposed changes recommended in the officer recommendation, there would be a further reduction in demand for car parking using the statutory car parking requirements. The visitor parking provision has been taken out of the planning scheme in areas of the municipality that are deemed to be suited to lower car parking provision because of their proximity to the public transport network. So there is no visitor parking proposed on site, and it obviously would be impractical to accommodate that in the stacker/shuttle system that's proposed.
Thank you.
And through you, Mr. Chair, if this proposal is supported, the occupants don't qualify for parking permits.
Thank you, Mr. D'Alessandro. It's important to know. Councillor Brand and then Councillor Crawford, Councillor Pearl.
I've got several questions to ask, but I'll just ask them one at a time.
Yes, thank you.
Ask about parking is in the surrounding streets. Is it time-controlled parking? Are there any surrounding streets that don't have time-controlled parking in the area within, close walk?
Mr. D'Alessandro.
Through you, Mr. Chair, you're testing me now. Farrar Street has 4 hours parking, and there's also on the opposite side restricted parking. So Bank Street on this side of the development is all-day parking, and then around near the market is quite restricted. So to answer that question, there is high parking restrictions. But in relation to this part of Bank Street, I'll just find out and look on Intramaps. But yeah, but being South Melbourne and in this particular area, it is quite restricted. So as we said, there are 53 apartments, there are 40 proposed car spaces, and as a result of recommending a reduction of the height by 1 storey and reducing the setback from the western boundary by 3 metres will result in further reduction in apartment numbers, so that will bring it in line with the planning scheme. So the ones that aren't provided with a car space are generally the 1-bed apartments which is quite consistent with other developments in the area. And given this is in the South Melbourne Activity Centre, its location to the light rail, we would support a reduction in car parking in this location.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Do you have any other questions?
Well, still on the same one, I'm just not quite understanding what the situation in Bank Street is in terms of the parking restrictions on the street there. Because if the residents in this development won't be able to get a parking permit, that works very well anywhere with parking restrictions, and of course it's meaningless in somewhere which doesn't have parking restrictions. Oh, sorry, I'll try better. I was just saying that yes, I'm happy to do that.
If that's okay, Councillor
Brand,
Brand, we'll move to Councillor Crawford while that information's being sought.
Well, mine's a follow-up on that. I just wanted to check. When we discuss things with applicants, they are very clear that in the future these kind of builds will never be able to get any permit street parking, which will be in line with our policy that we actually want less people to have cars in our municipality.
Ms. Fuller?
So it's really made clear to the applicant, though, that in the current, if they were to build, that their future apartments will not be applicable as per our policy to get car parking permits.
Through you, Mr Chair, yes, that's correct. It's made known publicly on Council's website. Following up any decision that Council makes to support applications, notification is provided in writing to reiterate that provision.
Thank you. Councillor Pearl?
Thanks. Just wondering where the applicant is this evening, if there's the applicants here or we know where they are.
Through you, Mr Chair, we encourage the applicant to, they know about tonight. It's unfortunate that they're not here to represent themselves, and we haven't heard from them. We've sent them an invitation, and that's all of council officers we can do.
So, and just to follow up, if I could, I was about to say Mayor, Councillor Simic, Chair, sorry. How engaged have they been since the consultation that we had that was chaired by Councillor Simic 3 or 4 months ago?
Through you, Mr Chair, I think it's fair to say that there's been little involvement from the applicant since the consultation meeting. And as the residents have pointed out, they've not identified any proposed changes or responses to the issues that were raised at the meeting. Nonetheless, Council's officers have tried to adopt some changes as proposed in the conditions to address the issues that have been raised.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl, and thank you for the promotion. Councillor Voss.
Thank you, Chair. Just like to query your recommendation to delete one of the levels. Do you have an idea of which level that would be, and subsequently how many apartments that would then reduce?
Through you, Mr Chair, the non-compliance that was identified in terms of the daylight provision that is the justification for the deletion of the level actually emanates from the proposed penthouse level. However, given the constraints of the stairwell location and mindful of the car parking provision, it has been selected that level 9 be removed, which would result in 4 dwellings being removed from the development as a whole. That would include 2 two-bedroom apartments, 1 one-bedroom apartment and 1 three-bedroom apartment. From a technical perspective, pursuant to clause 5206 of the scheme, that reduces the car parking requirement by 5 car parking spaces.
Thank you. Councillor Voss, do you have a further question?
Yes, so, but none of the car parking spaces in the document, in the application would be reduced. It would just be the apartments.
There's no intention to change the provision of car parking.
Thank you.
All right. Councillor Crawford.
I know I have flagged it before. Is there any way that we can not include the small cafe, which would be probably unviable anyway in that location, require them to do something more innovative with that, as opposed to a cafe that can't make money and possibly can't because of the size? Is there a way of amending to not include a cafe?
Through you, Mr Chair, council officers recognise the limitations of the size of the premises. However, we think that some type of use of a similar nature is important for the activation of the street. There are some limitations on what can be provided in the residential growth zone in terms of other commercial premises, but yes, there's some options for looking at alternative uses. The applicant was approached on that matter, particularly following the consultation meeting, and they didn't offer an alternative.
Thank you, Ms. Vuller. Councillor Voss.
Thank you. I just want to take up a question that Mr Dowd raised around precedents. So this is in a comprehensive development zone. Effectively, as I understand it, there's no height limit, but there is a discretionary height of 13.5 metres. This building is going well above that, maybe 40 metres. Now, what does that mean if Park Towers was redeveloped in the future? Does this have implication on the rest of the site, given that lots of people have been talking about it be a low density, rather than that high? Just wondering what you think.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Was that clear to officers' question?
Through you, Mr Chair, the residential growth zone that applies to the subject site and the Park Towers site does have a discretionary height limit, but it has been identified as a site that could accommodate higher development and reflects the non-conforming height of the existing Park Towers building on site. Each application would be assessed on its individual merits. We're not aware of any proposal. There's no proposal before council at this point in time to redevelop the Park Towers site. Obviously, it would be, just as this application has been, thoroughly scrutinised by council's urban design team, as well as our strategic and heritage advisor.
Thank you. Councillor Voss.
Like Councillor Pearl, I'm really disappointed the applicant hasn't bothered to turn up tonight, because I had quite a few questions to ask, such as, how often that exchange is being used, how often their car parking is actually being utilised, for example. And I know in this motion, the officers have recommended using one of their car parks as a service vehicle or tradesperson's car park. So my question is, do you actually know how much it's used? Do you know whether those two car parks that they have there could be taken over entirely?
Through you, Mr Chair, we approached the applicant to confirm exactly the demand that Telstra have for the site for car parking, and it was identified that 2 spaces is all that they require. Anecdotally, I have noticed on site inspection that there are more than that number of vehicles, but as to how often and for how long those vehicles are in attendance at the site, I can't be certain, and it's a shame the applicant isn't here to answer that question as well. It is possible to fully dedicate those 2 spaces at the eastern end of the site for service vehicles, etc., or a loading zone if council so wishes. But obviously then that would result in what Telstra vehicles do attend the site utilising the car parking spaces that the residents have explained are heavily utilised at the moment.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? I've got one. Oh, Councillor Brandt. We're still investigating. Have we come to a conclusion to Councillor Brandt's question about car parking restrictions in the area?
Sorry, through you, Mr Chair. So in regards to surrounding this site, so Bank Street, Farrar Street, Park Street and Cecil Street, it's all ticketed, so that means it's unrestricted. In relation to opposite the site, it's restricted. It's permit zone plus 1 hour, so the 1 hour would coincide with Market and South, the activity centre. And then on the opposite side, in relation to Farrar Street, it's all restricted as well. So it's a combination of ticket and restricted.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandro. I've got a question for the officers regarding something that was raised by one of the residents regarding rubbish in the area and rubbish management. I know that in the officers' recommendation, further information around this is sought from the applicants before they can proceed. But can you please elaborate a little bit on how rubbish management for the site's proposed and whether officers foresee any issues with the current proposal?
Mr Chair, the waste provision is intended to operate that residents would take their refuse down through the lift to the ground floor waste facilities that are provided at the southwestern corner of the site. The applicant was urged to look at this situation, as we understand that human behaviour may result in people choosing not to recycle, etc., because of the limitations that they face. However, the applicant has said because of the ongoing operation of the Telstra Exchange, it's not possible to accommodate a chute-type arrangement in the building. Nonetheless, we have put a condition in Council's officer recommendation to address this and look at this further, and we'll review that at the time.
And through you, Mr Chair, in regards to the dumping of rubbish and the trolley that was raised, I'll take that up with our local laws officers.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandro. I've just got one more question before I go back to Councillor Voss and Councillor Brand. That's outstanding on my list, and that's just regarding the car stackers. There's some issues raised around the car stackers. The officers, can officers elaborate on how the car stackers are supposed to operate and whether there's any issues in relation to the car stackers from your point of view?
Mr Chair, the traffic engineers have reviewed the material that has been submitted by the applicant. The system is a little bit different to the standard. It is a stacker/shuttle arrangement involving residents placing their cars in a car cabin that will automatically take the car up to the car parking level. The time provision for that is indicated to be 150 seconds, including user time plus the operation time of the facility. One of the conditions requires further detail to be submitted of the car stacker arrangement because it is a unique type of facility that they are proposing. However, we understand that it could accommodate a various array of vehicle sizes and types. If you have a look at the elevation plans, there's a considerable height in that level to accommodate that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Voss.
Thank you. Just also take up another question from one of the speakers tonight about the lack of solar panels, green infrastructure. What is our response to that? Why aren't we asking them or putting in a condition?
Through you, Mr Chair, there is in fact some there was some reference in the submissions from residents that there was no provision of water tank, etc. There's a 10,000 litre provision proposed on site. There is also a rain garden proposed, which is the big indentation that you see on the eastern side, the southern side of the building that follows up through all the levels. The report submitted as part of the application indicates that the proposal could achieve a 4-star Green Star rating. A condition is proposed to lock in further detail relating to other initiatives that could be incorporated into the design. There is a reference in the ESD report that was submitted with the application that there would be some gas-supported, gas backup supported solar hot water units, but we can certainly look at improving that further if required.
Thank you very much, and Councillor Brand.
Yes, I'd like to take up another question that was asked by a member of the gallery, of the audience, from Rosanna, who's representing her parents who live on the 9th floor and are concerned about being overshadowed and about losing their daylight. Can you explain, I know it's be easier with diagrams, but can you explain verbally the relationship between the height of the proposed building to their place on the 9th floor with the separation? If you can use your sort of expertise as shadow and sun analysts, and try and give an impression of how much direct sunshine they might lose, and how much daylight they might be losing, and how much overshadowing they're likely to have.
Through you, Mr. Chair, there is a shadow assessment included in the application plans that form part of the attachments to this, which indicates that largely the shadow that will be cast by the development would fall to the west of the site. It's from 1 p.m. onwards that the building itself starts to be affected by shadowing up the height of the Park Towers building. In relation to the 9th floor, it's anticipated that that wouldn't occur until 3 p.m, as per the information provided. But I think the important distinction that needs to be made is shadowing and daylight access are two different things. The overshadowing assessment largely takes in consideration of impact to open space areas, none of which are proposed to be overshadowed as a result of the development. The officer recommendation for deletion of the level is a result of adoption of the technical non-standard requirement that we would ordinarily apply in a unit development situation to assess the offset distance between a building and adjacent habitable room windows. And there's a minor non-compliance that would occur for the top level, hence the proposed deletion of a level to drop the height down to ensure that adequate daylight access is retained.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. On a follow-up.
I'm sorry, I just need to follow that. I'm a little. I'm not sure whether I've asked the question right or heard the answer right, but I'm not sure. I mean, my feeling would be that an apartment on the 9th floor of Park Towers would not ever be overshadowed by the 10th floor, as we're proposing, of the building, given that it's sort of pretty much due north of it. Is it due north or is it due? Sorry? Oh, yeah. So, except at sunrise and sunset, the shadow cast by a building which is essentially 1 story higher than you is not going to.
So, Councillor Brand, can you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah,
the question. I can't.
Can you just recheck the question about whether an apartment on the 9th floor would ever be overshadowed by a building set 17 metres away, which was one story further higher?
All right, I can see that officers are just checking. We'll give them a moment to consolidate. I'm sorry, I can see your hand up, but unfortunately, because of our meeting laws and procedure, I'm not able to entertain any further questions or comments from the gallery. I apologise about that.
Through you, Mr Chair.
Thank you.
I'd like to try and take you to the shadow plans that were produced with the application, and I think that gives us a good indication on the shadowing that's caused on Park Towers in regards to this part of the building.
Mr. Sandra, do you know what page that is in the plans?
It's TP 502-B, but what I'm trying to get at is the shadow starts to cast on the development at 1 p.m, and then it increases at 2 p.m. at the equinox, and then at 3 p.m. it takes us up to around about the 7th floor and portions of the 8th floor, and also the 9th. So if we take away a floor, and it's not the penthouse, because the penthouse is set back slightly, so it's a floor below, we're improving on that shadow. What we also need to take into consideration is the existing shadow on Park Towers. So there's a floor plan that actually shows shadows, existing shadows that are already caused. And this development, part of it is overshadowed to existing shadow, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandro. Any further questions from councillors? Ms. Wooler, would you like to add to the response?
Through you, Mr Chair, I just wanted to point out, I think an important factor in this proposal is that the eastern elevation is proposed to be set back quite significantly, and that would assist the Park Towers building to a large extent. That was just an additional point I wanted to make.
Thank you. Councillor Brand?
And could I just get you to explain to the to our gallery the daylight, the standard for the protection of daylight amenity, which is different from overshadowing and what have you. Just that we're sort of using on this to, or you're proposing that we use to this on to calculate the need for reducing the building by 1 storey to make it come into full compliance with this standard. And could you just explain what the standard actually protects?
Through you, Mr Chair, yes, that's correct. We have adopted the daylight standard, which I mentioned earlier, is not technically applicable in this application. However, we have sought the input of the applicant to this. There's a variation of in the order of 1 to 2 metres of separation distance that isn't achieved due to the proposed height of the building. So hence the requirement to reduce the overall height, and then given the generous offset distances, the remainder of the building would far exceed the daylight standards that would normally be applied.
Thank you, Ms. Wooler. Any further questions from councillors? Now we'll move to the recommendations, and I'd have an alternate recommendation I'd like to put, but as is our process normally, I'll first of all ask if any councillors would like to put any recommendation. Councillor Voss? Councillor Brand?
I'd like to put the officer's recommendation.
Okay, do we have a seconder? Councillor Copsey? Okay, Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the officer's recommendation?
Yes. We've heard a lot of questions raised about the impact of this building, and I think most of them have been answered, or have been the information we've been given means that those questions are answerable, and I'll look forward to talking about some of those. But in general, I think this proposal ticks many boxes in our planning scheme. It's in one of the more minor elements of it is the is the heritage solution that it provides. I'm not 100% clear why the Telstra building warrants heritage protection, but I'm very happy that industrial heritage, that we have protection for industrial heritage buildings, and I'm very glad to see that we have the ability to actually adapt in all sorts of interesting and creative ways, new buildings interlocking with old industrial buildings, which really are not things of beauty. They're not able to be. The beauty of them isn't really able to be destroyed by a relationship with a new building standing on top of it. But the relationship is a really interesting one, and I think just on that point, I think it's quite an innovative thing. I think the architecture of it is quite good. I honestly, speaking as an architect, if I thought this was going to be a hideous architectural carbuncle on the backside of South Melbourne, I would be voting against it. I think it's quite an elegant and interesting building, so I think it does that. They're minor issues. The major issue is the densification of our suburbs. We need to be more and more densified. All of Melbourne, especially the inner suburbs, needs to face the fact that we are densifying, and there's no way around it. And in the inner suburbs, it's the only real area where density is a virtue, because we like living in culturally rich and dense and deep places. And there are very few places in the city of Port Phillip there where it can be suitably done. There are very, very, very few places in the South Melbourne Albert Park area where it can be done, and this is one place that it can be done, and it can be done well, so I think we give it a tick for that. There are, in terms of economic development, this is a place which is actually going to bring further economic prosperity and development to the area, or not development, but prosperity. There's a tiny cafe proposed for it, but this will bring more patrons to all of the area, including the market. And the main thing that we've been queried on, really, I suppose, is the parking provisions. Since all of the streets are restricted parking, this is actually a good outcome for the people who are worried about parking, because the people who live in these apartments will not be able to park their car for more than an hour or whatever the restriction is, certainly not habitually, in the street. This will bring people to live in South Melbourne who don't have a car and don't bring a car and actually will walk to the market. What could be more ideal than having people who walk to the local shops, walk to the market, provide more patronage without bringing their cars? This is a building which will discourage people from bringing cars into it. And that all depends on the streets being restricted, because there's just no chance of leaving your car out overnight, for instance. So on many, many points, this is a very, I think, desirable development. I'm very concerned about the impact that it has on the people of Park Towers, especially the people on the lower levels. I honestly feel Rosanna's parents on the 9th floor, except that they may lose some view, which happens in all planning applications, and losing a view, I'm afraid, is something which we cannot consider as part of the planning scheme. This is a fundamental state government-wide thing that views aren't protected by the planning scheme when there's developable land next to it. Everything else, I really feel the sunlight, the daylight, the overshadowing, overlooking, all of those sorts of things will not be a problem for your parents on that. Maybe the view, but the others, I don't think so. I worry more and more for the people who live on the lower and lower floors. When you get to the bottom, well, it's probably being overshadowed anyway by the Telstra building. But it is a problem. I feel very sensitive about decreasing the amenity of residents in that particular building. But these are rules which are, the actual limits that our planning scheme puts on development are much tighter than what apply here. Like you can't build. Well, there are various restrictions that start coming at 9 metres away, but this is 15, 16, 17 metres away. It's completely compliant, especially if we take that one floor off. It's completely compliant with all of our amenity provisions for everybody else in the city of Port Phillip. So I can see lots of pluses. I can see several fears which I think should be completely allayed, and I see very few negatives. And they're the negatives that we actually have no power under the planning scheme to remedy.
Thank you.
That's why I'd be supporting this.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Copsey?
I think you've said most of the points that need covering, Councillor Brand. I'm happy to support the officer's recommendation here. I note the concern, but I do thank those who've come and presented tonight. It's been a really good quality of discussion, and thanks to the officers for all of the clarifying information provided. I do note the proposed conditions which do address several of the concerns that have been raised and ameliorate some of the impacts that we've heard about tonight. I agree that this is an area where there is really good public transport connection that is frequent and goes places that people need to go. And I also concur with the point that Councillor Brand raised that this is actually going to bring more local residents to come and visit the local shops and the market in particular. So I'm satisfied that might not be a build that addresses everybody's perfect items, and there might be some elements that each of us individually would prefer weren't there. I think overall it's a good fit for the area and a good outcome based on the conditions proposed by officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gross.
Sorry,
we'll get to that next. So go ahead, Councillor Gross. You had your hand up.
The only point I wanted to make was I've been discussing. I'm going to vote in favour of this, but I just ask us to think about this relatively arbitrary deletion of level 9 in condition clause R. Sometimes I think when we try to diminish the impact on amenity and on the fears of local residents, that we sometimes delete and lose some of the elegance that some buildings have. I'm thinking particularly of the SB Tower, the sort of pointed oval tower in the St Kilda Junction. All of these buildings had stories removed and lost some of the power and elegance of their design. I agree with everything that Councillor Brand has said about this is such a desirable place to live that we should not be hesitant about enabling more residents to come and live here, because it's near to the market and great infrastructure, including transport infrastructure. So I just thought I wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Voss, I believe you have an amendment.
Yes, I do. A small amendment to number 11 in the officer's conditions.
Okay, we'll move to number 11 of the officer's recommendation. And what's your amendment, Councillor Voss?
So, including provision for solar water heating to the apartments. Just wanting to check if that's wording's okay by the officers. It's slightly different to the word panels. Yep. Including provision for solar water heating to the apartments.
Okay, so that's the addition of the words including provision of solar hot water to the apartments. So we believe we understand the sentiment of what's been proposed in the amendment. Is there a seconder for this amendment? Councillor Baxter. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak in respect to the amendment?
just taking on board what some of the people in the community have mentioned around, not enough green infrastructure in this building. I think they could do better as well. So it is a Telstra Exchange that's having some uplift of a number of stories there with residential development, and I think they could show us and the community around them, how sustainable they can be.
Thank you. Councillor Baxter.
Just briefly to say that this is in line with our efforts to reduce emissions throughout the community and to encourage uptake of renewables, and it would be of great benefit to whoever the residents there are there.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. As an amendment has been moved, we're talking strictly and specifically about the amendment. Are there any other speakers wishing to speak in favour or against the amendment? Councillor Brand, you have a clarifying question of the officers? Yes, you can ask a clarifying question of the officers.
Could I just ask, is there any problem with this specifying solar hot water as opposed to any other service? Or
through you, Mr. Chair, I had alluded to the fact before that some is actually proposed. On TP 116, which is the roof plan of the proposal, it actually identifies an area for PV panels for solar hot water. The condition will just simply reinforce what's identified on the plans.
Okay, well that's okay. Any other speakers in favour or against the amendment? Councillor Copsey?
It's just a follow-on clarifying question. Do you know if it's... I think that therefore that's probably acceptable, but I'm wondering whether it should say to the apartments. I don't know whether provision is made for in the plans for servicing all apartments, and I wonder if it might be acceptable to the mover to just put a full stop after including provision for solar hot water, which keeps the thing but won't, yeah.
So questions being put as the mover. Councillor Voss, are you amendable to a change in wording, or would you like to keep the wording as is?
I think I'll keep it as it is because I just might put it to the shop and that might be a perverse outcome.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Councillor Baxter, obviously since the mover wants to keep it, we'll stay as is. Councillor Copsey, do you have any other further clarifying questions? All right. Any speakers in favour or against? Councillor Voss, I believe you get to close. Not on an amendment. So we'll move to a vote. All those in favour of this amendment? All those against? That amendment passes and is now forms part of the substantive resolution. We'll return to debate on the resolution as a whole. Are there any other speakers wishing to speak in favour or against? Councillor Voss, I believe you haven't spoken. Yes,
no,
you may speak.
Haven't spoken to the substantive motion, but I will say once again that I am very disappointed that the applicant didn't come. Unfortunately, all three ward councillors were at the consultation meeting with the applicant and a number of the residents that are here today. And there were numerous issues that were raised, and unfortunately none of them were willingly altered by the applicant. But thank you to the officers for this motion, because it does actually rein some of those issues in, and some of those issues are, for example, the service vehicles, reduction in height, a little bit more setback and articulation. So it does address some of the height issue. I just wanted to say in particular thank you to the Bank Street residents that have come out and spoken about their concerns with this particular application, and also to the Park Towers residents. I too share your feelings. I don't like this building at all, and I think it's actually going to be quite a shock when people around the area are going to be sort of driving or walking and then all of a sudden see this sort of come out of the ground. The landmark has been up till now Park Street Towers, and there's nothing sort of higher than sort of 2 stories in the whole area. So it is new for South Melbourne. It is allowed, and as Councillor Brand has said, it's really breaking no rules, and in fact it's encouraged. Unfortunately, there's nothing much we could, reject this sort of development on. Parking will be stressed, and I think there are other issues as well, such as loading bays for people moving in and moving out, and also the waste, I think, is not particularly great at all. However, we have a organisation such as Telstra, which has obviously given Grocon instructions to go and find, pick which Telstra exchanges are out there that they'd like to build height on to make some money, and I guess that's what we're stuck with in this particular application. So we've made it as good as we can, and so I do sympathise with it, but hopefully with some urban art on it, we will grow to appreciate the look of that building. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watts. Councillor Crawford.
I just wanted to say that I do understand change is hard, and we're seeing it all over our community constantly. And as part of that change, there is an adjustment that's required on how we move around our city, which we are trying to back up with our new move, live and strategy. And part of that is the rethinking of people having cars. So the good news is that as part of that, people moving into this facility will not be able to park on the street. So the idea is that people move in and you share cars or use the public transport, which we are seeing happening more and more. And, it is harder day to day to get parks, but by providing more restrictions, it means that less people are likely to have more than the car that they use. I would speak to the applicant who is not here that a cafe is not a particularly great outcome. You could always make a social housing donation to the area if you want to redeem yourself and for any of the other parts to this build. It's not ideal, but it does meet regulations, and it is in a spot that can accommodate more people using the public transport. But I do think that as we move to the future, it's that future of Nightingale where people can't have cars as they move to the area, and we encourage them to rethink that as they move and buy and live and rent in our area of how they get around the municipality.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. Any further speakers? Councillor Pearl.
At the time of the call-in, so a councillor called this application in, and at the time of the call-in, I don't think there were sufficient objections, a number of objections to get it to a council meeting. So the reason and I'm not sure if subsequent objections have come in, so they haven't. So I illustrate that point that I want to show to the objectors here that council laws take this application very, very seriously, because without our intervention it never would have come to the meeting here this evening or the meeting 3 or 4 months ago. I'm in two minds about it. I don't mind development on this site according to the planning scheme. I think the outcome that we see here today in terms of the officer's recommendation is adequate, but I wouldn't say it's a best outcome. What I am in two minds about is the willingness of the applicant to actually work with the community to get a good outcome here. So we, as councillors, nine of us have sat in consultations, and there's the good, the bad and the ugly. And I would describe the consultation for this one as pretty constructive and pretty good. I didn't see a group of residents that had pitchforks and weren't willing to negotiate or budge on what were fairly reasonable concerns. And I saw an applicant that wasn't necessarily coming to play ball on their plan and trying to work with the community, and that's been evidenced in the past 3 months. So I'm far from impressed with that, and I don't think going forward from here we're going to see an improved outcome, and it actually makes me doubt whether or not this thing is actually going to get built. I'll reluctantly vote for the officer's recommendation tonight when I was going to
flip and vote against it, but I don't frankly think that it achieves much, because ultimately I think it is a site that needs to build on, and this is the problem we're going to face more and more of in the next 5 to 10 years. We already face a bit of it on St Kilda Road, but 14 metre separation and a minimum, it's going to be greater than that, is fairly generous compared to some of the problems we're going to face in Fisherman's Bend, and we're already facing around Albert Road and along St Kilda Road. There's nowhere near that separation on some of those blocks. I don't think it's a great outcome for the residents on Bank Street. It's not the sort of interface that I would want down the road, but I think there's adequate separation between the houses and where this development is, albeit you will obviously disagree with me, and I respect your viewpoint to do that. So reluctantly I'll vote for the officer's recommendation this evening, but it was a bit of a 50-50 bet, and if someone can convince me otherwise in the next couple of minutes, I'll be open to hear it.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Any further speakers? Councillor Bond.
I'm of a similar mind to Councillor Pearl, and I'm still not sure which way I'll go. I extremely dislike car stackers. I just don't think they're an answer. And I just don't think people will buy in a building with a car stacker. The more you experience them, the less people are going to buy in buildings with them. So I think that will be an issue here. I'm not sure what the future is of Park Towers, and perhaps what happens on this site should have been tied into the future of Park Towers. It's now a 50-year-old building, I think even more, 1960s, early 1960s or mid-1960s, so it's now 50-something years. It's coming to its last couple of years of its life. So 50. We don't know what's going to happen there. There's a parking shortfall and visitor parking shortfall here, which I'm not overly happy with. I think buildings such as this should at least provide some visitor parking. And then there's the interface between this building and a largely two-storey residential zone in surrounding streets that we're very well managed to maintain and keep intact because of heritage overlays over this area. But ultimately you look at the planning scheme in this area and this building complies. And our role is to sit here as councillors and say, does it not comply with the City of Port Phillip building scheme? And in this instance, the answer is yes. As much as I don't really like the building and I don't really think there's a lot of issues with it, I certainly wouldn't be buying one in here. If that's my test of whether or not I approve a building, I wouldn't approve it. But unfortunately, we look at the planning scheme and say, does this meet the planning scheme of the City of Port Phillip? And the answer is, by and large, it does. So there's very limited grounds on which we can reject this, even if some of us maybe really want to. So unfortunately, I'm another one that's going to be very reluctantly supporting this.
Thank you, councillors. I'll take a moment to speak to the resolution myself. I won't be supporting it tonight on a number of grounds, and I'll set them out in a moment. I think that this proposal really clearly demonstrates some of the issues with the planning scheme as a whole. The planning scheme's set at the state government level, and councillors are forced to implement it. Regardless, I think that the proposal, the scale of it, is contrary to a number of our provisions, and also that the height of it would be excessive and have an adverse impact on the character of the area. I'm concerned about the amenity impact on Park Towers and also the connection with Park Towers. I'm worried about the issues that this will raise around parking. I really take on board Councillor Crawford's comments about Nightingale model, but this does not meet the benchmark of a Nightingale model. The design overall falls short. I believe that the proposal also sets out inadequate loading facilities and creates issues around waste and recycling facilities. So I believe that there's enough grounds to refuse this application. If it's not successful, and I suspect given the speakers we've had tonight that the officer's recommendation will succeed, but if it doesn't, if I've been able to change a couple of the councillors' minds, then I will foreshadow that I'll move an alternate recommendation, which is for council to issue a notice of refusal to grant a planning permit. So I'd also like to thank everybody who's participated in this process to date. I'm furious that the applicants are not here and that the applicants have not listened to any of the concerns and comments from the community have not taken it upon themselves to even try and amend their plans to meet some of the concerns, which I believe, and I agree with Councillor Pearl, they were completely reasonable concerns. So if this is how they're proposing to enter the community and be part of the community, I think that falls short of our test in South Melbourne. So for me, this proposal is inadequate, and like I said, if the officer's recommendation fails, we'll move an alternate recommendation. Councillors, are there any further speakers? I believe everyone's spoken now. So I'll move to a vote. You do have a right to close, Councillor Brand. Would you like to close?
I would like to close. I certainly understand where Councillor Simic is coming from, but I think in this circumstance, if you say that if the height is excessive, I think you need to say why. And I think if you say that there are all sorts of sort of amenity impacts which are unacceptable, you need to nominate which, because the way that we have this in front of us now is that there is not one measure, well, there's not one impact that we have measures for that this is non-compliant with. And so, other councillors have indicated their degree of regret of voting for it, which is completely valid. But ultimately, if we vote down a proposal which is entirely compliant with the planning scheme, it goes straight to VCAT, and VCAT says it's entirely compliant with the planning scheme. Go ahead with it. So we're just not in a position. We have to be careful with our sentiment and our desire to please when we're making these decisions. It's not just what you'd prefer. It's actually what you think is possible to defend as in a decision. We are all responsible for our planning scheme as well, and that's a long-term thing which can't be altered. We can't alter the planning scheme on the spot, and each time we come up with a decision to make. I want to pick up just a point that Councillor Gross raised, which is the actual architectural values and the danger of on the council. The danger of chopping and changing a considered piece of architecture for various reasons. I actually feel that the 11-storey version, the version with two slabs of 3-storey apartments is actually quite an elegant and well-resolved piece of architecture, which I think would do very well, and I think it actually suffers for having one story sliced off it. It makes it just less balanced, less coherent. It's a less clear piece of architecture, and I think it would look better for time immemorial if it actually was a taller, slimmer, more elegant building. And I was prepared to actually go into battle for that, but I had questions to ask. Well, I had questions I'd like to ask the architects, or if not them, their representatives as the planning consultants. But they're not here. I can't ask the questions. I can't work my way around it. In addition, taking that extra story off is what makes this whole thing 100% compliant with the planning scheme, with all the measures that we have at least in the planning scheme. And I think that the people of Park Towers on the lowest floors deserve at least, the full protection that we can give. So, there goes that floor against my architectural instincts, but I think it's the only right thing to do. I think it's the least we can do on this. And we're all going to feel unhappy about the other impacts that aren't measurable and aren't predictable.
All right, debate on this resolution has exhausted, and I'll move to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? That resolution is carried. Thank you. We'll move now to item 6.3, Statutory Planning Delegate Report for August 2019. Is that really 6.3? There being no questions from the audience with respect to 6.3, I'll move to questions from the councillors. Are there any questions from councillors regarding this report?
I'm happy to move.
Councillor Gross has moved the report. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Copsey? Councillor Voss? Nobody yet. Councillor Voss is seconding it. All right. Councillor Gross, would you like to speak?
No, thank you.
Councillor Voss? Anyone else? We'll then move to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? So I'll take that vote again. That wasn't very clear. All those in favour? All those against? That resolution is carried. I'll move to 6.4, which is 118 Bertie Street in Port Melbourne. There being no speakers from the public, councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? There being no questions, do I have a councillor that will move either the officer's recommendation or something else? Councillor Voss?
Chair, I have an alternative motion.
Yes, what's your alternative motion?
It's to 3.1.1, an addition of half a sentence again. So I'll read the whole thing out. It says, advise the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning that Council supports the application as proposed for the reasons set out in this report, subject to conditions, including a condition requiring the provision of a dedicated car space for service vehicles.
Okay, so the alternate recommendations for the inclusion of the words including a good condition requiring the provision of a dedicated car space for service vehicles. Do we have a seconder for that alternate recommendation? Councillor Brand. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak?
No.
Councillor Brand, would you like to speak?
Yes. Just want to put on the record why. I think this is a defect in our planning scheme, that we actually do need stronger provision for service vehicles. I would call it visitors parking still, but whatever the case, because it's the one inelastic parking factor in the parking equation, that it doesn't matter. The residents can't help who comes to visit them, who needs to visit them, when their grandma comes, or when they've got to do something like that, or when tradesmen come, or when all sorts of factors that crop up. We can make planning provisions that actually encourage people not to live with cars, and actually make it impossible for them to live with cars if they want to live there, and so they choose to come without a car and get all the other benefits, and we benefit from that. But you can't tell people to do without tradesmen or whatever the other visitors are. So we should be keeping the provision of service vehicles and for visitors quite inelastic, and we should be working flat out on the actual residents' vehicles in the most creative ways to reduce their car ownership and car usership in every single possible way. You can't tell tradesmen to turn up on the tram.
Thank you, Councillor Brand, for setting out your reasons. Are there any other councillors wishing to speak either for or against this resolution? There being no further speakers, I'll move to a vote. All those for? Against? That motion is carried unanimously. (6.5) 248, 254, 256, 262, 264, 270 at Normanby Road, South Melbourne, and 203, 205 Normanby Road, South Melbourne. So 4 towers. There being no speakers from the public, councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? There being no questions from the officers, is there a councillor wishing to either move this or something else? So the officer's recommendation or something else? Councillor Voss, moving the officer's recommendation? And would anyone like to second the officer's recommendation? Councillor Copsey. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak? Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak? Would any councillor like to speak? Councillor Voss, would you like to close? There being no speakers, I thank the officers for the work on this report. I'll move to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? And that's also carried unanimously. Councillors, we'll now move to urgent business. Are there any matters of urgent business? There being no matters of urgent business, I can declare this meeting closed at... Sorry? Okay. There being no confidential matters either, which we'll go to next, I can now declare this meeting closed at 10 minutes past 8 o'clock. Thank you everyone for participating.